So I'll confess, I'm going to have to switch gears a little bit with the sacred gathering this week. My hope the next few weeks had been to get through the Sermon on the Mount and get done with it before Lent, but we just kind of ran out of time with a few funky Sundays in there, the Super Bowl, etc. And so it kind of snuck up on us this week. In the traditional church calendar is what's called Transfiguration Sunday. Transfiguration Sunday is the last Sunday before we get into Lent. So Transfiguration Sunday, this coming Sunday, will lead into Ash Wednesday, which is the official start of Lent, and next Sunday will be the first Sunday of Lent. So what is Lent, and why do we bother with the church calendar in the first place? Lent is the 40 days leading up to Easter. The 40 days representing both Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, in which he was showing kind of solidarity, reliving the 40 years in the wilderness, in which God was taking a group of slaves and helping form them into a new people, a new kind of people that were to represent him to the world, to show a reliance on him as they lived in the wilderness. And so Jesus, to start his ministry out, went out into the wilderness and fasted and lived off the land and showed just kind of his trust in God, the fact that he was part of the big story. And so we do the same thing each year going into Easter. Easter is, of course, the central holiday in all of Christian belief, the belief that God came among us, that he died, killing, of course, our sin and death itself, and that he was resurrected, showing us the way to go into that. And the Christian church over time developed this kind of practice of Lent, this idea of joining Jesus in his 40 days, because I just think rhythms are really important to remind ourselves of this story. I've heard people complain that um, this kind of central belief in Easter and celebrating the resurrection is something that can kind of catch people off guard. We celebrate it in the spring because spring is, of course, a beautiful reminder each year of renewal and such. But I've heard people say that they just feel caught off guard by Easter. It's kind of like, ho hum, we're going along, then boom, Easter, we're supposed to feel excited, we're supposed to celebrate, and then we kind of move on. And that is not traditionally what the Christian church has done. They've created this church calendar so we can kind of get ourselves ready to prepare to focus on things a little bit because, of course, the cross, the fact that God came among us and we killed him, that we wanted nothing to do in our sinful state with the way God was, is a really important part of the story. The cross is truly horrible. That God himself tasted death is truly awful. And yet God brings resurrection and life and ultimate victory beyond all those things. And so, this idea of celebration, we want to acknowledge as well just some of the darkness that is in the world and that is in the Christian story. And so, we take this period of Lent, of going out into the wilderness, of kind of refocusing our lives to celebrate well the resurrection and the fact that we're part of a different kingdom, one that will be fully established beyond death, beyond sin and pain, and all these kind of uglier aspects of life. And so traditionally, Lent has a bit of a somber feel to it. It does focus on Ash Wednesday. It starts reminding us that we will die, that hopefully the fact that we will die one day can sharpen the way we use our time well. We don't have unlimited time. The way we use our time is meaningful, and we want God's desire in that. So it's often somber. It's one that many times people will fast, not eating as much food, to again be grateful for the food we've been given. At other times, people will abstain from certain things that they enjoy. They will step back to reprioritize, to recognize that these things are blessings, but that we can easily become addicted to them or too used to them, and view them as things that are our rights rather than blessings, gifts from God itself. So um, during Lent, people will, like I said, often fast or abstain from things that they enjoy, not because they're bad in of themselves, but to put them in kind of proper perspective, to make sure that they are not owning us in some way. But an important part of that as well is that our Sundays during Lent, Sundays are celebratory. They're times of worship. And so, whatever it is we're fasting or abstaining from, traditionally, you take a break from that on Sunday. You do the rest of the week, but Sundays are meant to be celebratory. They're meant to be enjoyed in God's presence. They're meant to be enjoying those blessings. So, it's just this kind of interesting rhythm of of focusing ourselves, of denying ourselves a little bit so we can celebrate a little bit better. Ultimately, those are small celebrations leading up to Easter itself. And then the final piece of that is what we're going to be doing here at Wayfarers itself is going to be looking at the Book of Lamentations. We looked at the Book of Lamentations a couple years ago, but I think it's one that's worth revisiting. Lamentations is a cycle of poems about pain and discovering where God is in those. I think it's a really good fit for many of the themes of Lent, but I'll get into that a little bit more next week, because this week, of course, we are celebrating Transfiguration Sunday. And Transfiguration Sunday always is the last Sunday before Lent, because I think, just like in the Gospels, this is a story that gives us hope of where this whole thing is heading. It shows Jesus in kind of his glorified state. We get to see Jesus as he actually is in eternity, which is, before they go back down the mountain and head into this difficult time of struggle Jesus had with religious and political leaders, ultimately ending in the cross. And so I think I think the Transfiguration functions a little bit like when we're swimming, we go up for that first breath of air before diving back in and really beginning the difficulty of a stroke. Or maybe if you're on a long hike and you're going to go through, forest or down valleys, up and downs. Sometimes when you get that view, you look up and you can see kind of the peak top of where you're heading. It can make it easier when you're down in the midst of a valley or the midst of a forest to remember that kind of sun-shining peak that you're headed for. So that's what I think we start this with the Transfiguration as we are going into Lent. So I'm going to read the account out of Matthew chapter 17. We're going to look at kind of this incredible experience, how baffled the disciples were by it in many ways, and how it might be helpful for us to be thinking about our experiences with God as we go into Lent and ultimately into Easter. So, at the beginning of this chapter, Matthew chapter 17, we read, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and brought them to the top of a very high mountain. He was transformed in front of them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all of this by saying to Jesus, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." And while he was still speaking, look, a bright cloud overshadowed them. A voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. I am very pleased with him. Listen to him." And hearing this, the disciples fell on their faces, filled with awe. But Jesus came and he touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. So just a little bit of context on what has happened. You might have caught the phrase, 6 days later, Jesus took these 3 with him up the side of this mountain. What those 6 days are referring to is right before this, in the context of the story overall, was one of the key moments in the Gospels, Peter at his absolute best, when Jesus asks all his disciples, "Okay, who am I? Who do the people say I am?" And the disciples say, "Well, some people think, you're one of the old prophets. Some think you're Elijah. Some think you're, John the Baptist." And Jesus says, "Okay, you've spent time with me. Who is it you think I am?" And Peter, as the spokesman, says, "I think you're the Messiah. You're God's sent one." And Jesus affirms this, saying, "Yeah, right on. You nailed it. God told you this. This is not something you could have come up with on your own." And then he immediately begins to teach them what is the significance of that, because their ideas of a Messiah, of course, are someone who is going to be a glorious king like King David or King Solomon in the Old Testament, someone willing to show up and kick butt and give them back their kingdom and make everything right again, so that they can be, have peace and prosperity and all the good things in life. And yet Jesus says, "You are right in saying who I am. I am the one sent by God. I am the one who was promised. But it's not going to turn out the way you're expecting. It's not all about you and your physical comforts, of you getting what you want. Let me show you what the world is like." And so those begin his first teachings about the cross. Jesus was not caught off guard by the oppression that he suffered. He knew this was coming. He knew that God was going to use this suffering to beat sin and death and those sorts of things. And then right after he kind of first describes the cross, which shocks the disciples, he issues kind of a new invitation, discipleship, and he tells them, of course, take up your cross and follow me. Come and suffer, come and die in a lot of ways that you may live, that you can be part of this kingdom. And so that's the context here of it's the first time the disciples have been exposed to this suffering, to the idea that the Messiah, the chosen one, could be someone who was meant to be misunderstood and meant to suffer so God could bring something even bigger out of it, which is, of course, what we're celebrating at Easter, and it's what we are preparing ourselves in Lent, the same way, taking up our crosses, denying ourselves in small ways so that we can remind ourselves of whose we are, of course. And yet we've got this crazy experience, which I think is going to be important. It's not all doom and gloom from this point onward. Jesus is reminding them that there is victory, there is light and life on the other side of this. And so they go up on this mountain with Jesus, and they see him kind of in his full glory. They get to see him as he is, as God, what he's leaving behind as he is heading to the cross. And this passage is one that when I did a lot of reading on, it can be a little tempting to get lost because there's a rich tapestry of Old Testament references and teachings in here. People really enjoy kind of picking this story apart to point out all the things. The things we've got Moses and Elijah and why they were chosen, maybe what they represent, why God shows up in the way he does, why he tells them to listen to him, how it might be connected back to Jesus' baptism, which has a lot of similarities to it. But I think as important as all those things are, I want to focus on kind of the experience itself that the disciples had, because it's pretty clear that the experience for them at the time is one that just kind of overwhelmed them. They're just filled with awe. They seem confused. They seem afraid. And I think that a lot of these other insights and are correct, but I think sometimes we need to just let things be as they are. We don't need to understand all of these experiences right then and there in the moment. And I think this story shows kind of a typical encounter with God, these overwhelming things that I think are so important to our spiritual lives, even though they are a rarity, even though they're a gift. So I wanted to point out just kind of a couple aspects of the story as we have it here. One is the setting, right? We are told that it was 6 days later, which a lot of people think is a reference to the Feast of Booths, which was always 6 days, and then on the seventh day a celebration would happen. And so 6 days after this confession, they have this wilderness experience. This might be something that Peter is picking up as well and offering to make shrines or booths for the three of them. But the idea is they have stepped out of kind of their normal routines. They have stepped out of kind of the normal places which they might relate to God. They're in the wilderness. They're on a mountaintop. And I think many, many people have had experiences with God, in powerful spiritual experiences that have come from stepping out of normal places. This isn't to say that, when we go on a spiritual retreat or we do something unusual, it's always going to happen by any means, but it provides a different opportunity to listen and for God to show up to say, I'm available and willing. They have climbed a mountain. They have stepped outside of their normal routine. There's just a few of them there, and they have this incredible experience of God showing up, of Jesus being revealed in an unusual way. I think that idea of perspective seems to be very common in these types of encounters. Just the fact that everything makes sense. For this moment here, as overwhelming and awe it is, they see Jesus as he is. They don't mistake him for a few short moments for simply a blue-collar guy coming out of an undesirable part of the country, right, who seems to know something about God. They aren't baffled by him. They're baffled by the experience. They see Jesus as he is. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of times when we have this sense of how close God is and how real things is. The pieces seem to fit in some way, even if we don't understand them. There's a sense that God is here, God knows what he's doing, there is a plan, I'm part of something bigger. And I think that's such an important part of those experiences, that feeling, even as it fades over time, recognizing we sometimes do step out of our normal confusion, our normal perspective, and just get in our guts, in our heart, that God is good, that things make sense, that God knows what he's doing. And I think they have a little of that here, looking at Jesus, having conversation with Moses and Elijah, hearing God's voice. There's a sense that they're in on something, that the pieces fit in a special way. I think Peter's kind of confused response shows one that's very typical as well, in that we want to stay. When we find ourselves in these heightened states of God's presence, it can be hard to go back down the mountain, to want to return to normal life, because it's just this space feels so full. This perspective we're having from God feels so important. But I think it's such an important reminder for those things, that those rare special moments are meant to kind of glorify, to illuminate our everyday lives, right? They do go back down the mountain, and we hear even before they get to the bottom of the mountain, it's kind of back to work. And these insights need to be applied in a certain way, in a special way. And so I think the last piece of this is just the fact that this experience is so overwhelming. Jesus tells them not to talk about it until later, because I don't think they have the perspective to truly understand what it is God is trying to teach them until later. This doesn't totally make sense, that Jesus can be glorified, he can be having these conversations with these incredible figures, he can be encouraged in what's ahead of him, until they're on the other side of the cross and the resurrection. They're allowed to tell this story afterwards. They're allowed to start wondering about the beauty that God came and chose to die and be resurrected, right? And so I think this is one of the really important aspects that we often miss about these incredible experiences of God or fullness or nature, whatever it is we've had, that it gives us those perspective, that makes us want to stay, that makes things feel right, and in fact we know God is there and God knows what he's doing, is the actual significance, what it actually matters of these experiences only becomes apparent over time. I think it only becomes apparent often through helped reflection from other people, right? Our own experiences are always compared against both kind of the tradition. Does this make sense with the way God has worked? Does it make sense with what God has revealed? Does it make sense with other people I love and respect who know God, have seen and know about God? This is a good way of trying to keep us from getting too weird, because if we base just on our feelings, just on our experiences, that's where cults come from. That's where weird pet theories can come from. We can have these experiences and we can check them with other people. We can also put them to other people's benefits. Sometimes we can tell these stories of times we knew God was real, when the things made sense. I can't help but wonder if Peter may have come back to experiences like this, of seeing Jesus in his fullness and his glory, when he's having a conversation later, when he's ashamed, when he recognizes he failed God in denying him, and yet Jesus is reinstating him, or is giving him more work to do later on in his life. I wonder if he looked back on experiences like that and said, well, I saw God. We saw God in his glory. This incredible thing changed me and helped me in some ways, even later on when I made mistakes. And so I think that's an important part of these reflections. At the moment, he's stumbling over his words, right? He doesn't know what the significances of this are. And yet it's clearly significant, and only over time, as Jesus allows them to continue to reflect on it, as the community continues to reflect on it, does it start to make sense? Does it start to have a kind of a full meaning as it's used by people and put to its best? And so I think Lent is always an opportunity for ones like this. I think all of us have had experiences that just feel fuller, that feel just more pregnant with meaning than our just kind of everyday existences. And we're often baffled of what to do with them at the time. And so Lent, like the experiences they're going to have here, they're going to be going into this difficult time of the cross. We will find ourselves rhythming our lives in a way that involves some self denial, of refocusing on things that are most important to us. But I think we're always invited going into times of reflection like Lent to first look back at those powerful, meaningful experiences we have had with God, however we understand them. And I think I want us to ask ourselves, like, what are some of those experiences? Why are we on this journey, even though it is sometimes confusing and it's difficult? In what ways do I understand what God was up to in those experiences? Do I understand them better now? Have they changed who I am or the meaning? Maybe not. God doesn't always explain the purposes and the meanings of these things. And yet, just as Jesus used this kind of transfiguration, as I said, kind of a sighting of where this thing is headed, a quick sighting of the hilltop before we dive down into a valley or into the forest and continue climbing. I think our own experiences of God, whether they make sense or not, just in their raw power, can be something that we can continue to return to and ponder and use to motivate us forward when we are in times of life that feel more like Lent and self denial and confusion, that feel more like this journey to the cross that we are reminding ourselves of in Lent. So I would just encourage you this week, look at this story. Think back on some of your own experiences of God. Use that to kind of launch our reflection as we go into Lent, and of course, even more importantly, go into celebrating Easter and Jesus' victory over sin and death itself.